Okay, so there are three minimum indicators of substance: the premises indicator, the bank account indicator, and either the director indicator or the employees indicator. If an entity is able to meet these minimum indicators of substance, what does this mean?
So if the entity is able to meet all the required indicators of substance, then it will be presumed not to be a shell. And this means the starting point is that none of the adverse tax consequences under the rules should apply to the entity, although there will still be a compliance cost because the entity will need to annually report its substance position and provide the necessary documentary evidence. If the entity is unable to meet one or more of the minimum substance indicators, the reverse is true and it will be presumed to be a shell, and so we'll move on to step 3. Before we do move on to step 3, though, Laura, I wondered if this was worth just taking a moment to reflect on whether these minimum indicators of substance represent a material shift in what is an acceptable minimum level of substance for holding companies in the UK. And for me, I think there are three sort of interesting themes that emerge, which suggest this is a shift towards a greater level of substance. The first point is the one mentioned at the outset about outsourcing. In the Jersey context, as we discussed last time, outsourcing functions within the same state as the entity will be sufficient to meet those substance rules, whereas it looks as if in the EU, outsourcing is in and of itself representative that the entity is potentially at risk of being a shell. The second thing is that I think ASED 3 represents an interesting shift towards imposing clear, bright line tests on substance. For example, as we discussed in our last podcast, the Jersey substance rules are frequently couched in terms of adequacy. So, for example, an entity must have an adequate physical presence or adequate employees. And I think this inherently introduces a degree of flexibility. It means different approaches can be adopted to reflect the activities of the entity in question. In contrast, the EU's approach is quite different and is seeking to introduce a minimum floor on substance that applies in all cases and without any real regard to the functions of the entity in question. The final observation I'd make is particularly in the context of the director condition, where I think ATAD 3 marked a shift towards focusing on the qualitative decision making of directors. This was already a theme that we saw emerging in the likes of the EU Danish cases and some of the discussion on beneficial ownership in the international fiscal context. But it is perhaps the first time we've seen it expressed to clearly require a need for active and independent decision making.
Really interesting. I agree that this is a definite shift towards a greater level of substance. Turning back to the draft directive now, so we've looked at step 1, the gateway, and we've looked at step 2, the minimum indicators of substance, and noted that an entity which meets the minimum indicators of substance should not be subject to the adverse tax consequences under the rules. However, not all entities with substance will necessarily be able to meet the required indicators of substance at step 2. And it's for this reason that step 3 of the rules gives entities that don't meet the indicator tests the opportunity to provide additional evidence in order to rebut the presumption that they are a shell.
Yes, and there might be good commercial reasons for using a clean company in a fund structure. For example, it might have been incorporated for banking or regulatory reasons. So, Laura, what do entities actually need to do in order to rebut the presumption?
What the entity needs to do is prove that it performed and controlled the activities that generate its relevant income. And it also needs to prove that it bore the risk of these activities. So specific evidence will need to be produced by the entity. For example, the entity will need to produce a document setting out the commercial rationale behind the establishment of the entity, as well as detailed information about employee profiles and decision making.
Yeah, that sounds like quite an administrative burden for entities, and maybe in practice then this sort of step 3 is not going to be that useful.
Yes, I think it's likely to be a large burden. However, if an entity has not been able to rebut the presumption at step 3, that's not the end of the story. The last remaining route out of the directive is to claim an exemption at step 4, the final get out of jail free card, if you like. Tom, in what circumstances could an entity claim this exemption?
So the exemption is only available if the existence of the entity doesn't reduce the tax liability of its beneficial owners or the group as a whole. and the entity will need to provide information allowing the comparison of the overall tax position with and without the existence of the entity. In essence, this is very similar to the idea of tracing that we discussed in our last episode. That is, a holding company should only be entitled to treaty relief if, but for the existence of the holding company, the investors in that entity would be eligible for treaty relief.
I see. So an exemption is really only available in quite limited circumstances. If the entity is unable to claim an exemption, it would be subject to adverse tax consequences in step 5.